So now we get to do the most exciting part of the project in my opinion, which is adding tulle to the skirt. The first thing I do is take my measuring tape and see what the distance is from the waistline to the end of my skirt. I work out that my skirt is 58 centimetres long. However, I'm not going to sew tulle right on the edge of the skirt, I'm going to sew it a couple of centimetres in, so I'm taking the full length as 56 centimetres. From looking at reference photos, it looks like Harley has roughly 8 rows of tulle on her dress. Because there's 8 rows of tulle, there will be 7 spaces in between these rows. You now want to work out what the length is of these spaces in between the rows. So I take my length, which is 56 centimetres, I divide it by the number of spaces between the rows, which is 7, and then I get the length of spaces between the rows, which is 8 centimetres. To mark out my lines, I take dressmaking chalk. This chalk is easy to remove afterward. So row 1 is going to be on the waistline. We measure 8 centimetres for row 2 and mark it. We measure 16 centimetres for row 3 and then mark that. 24 centimetres for row 4. And so on until I get to the end. It's always good practice to measure twice, so just double check your measurements afterwards. I then go ahead and do the other side. Obviously this is shorter as I've cut it that way, but I'm still going to measure down 8 centimetres each time until I get to the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and double check the measurement. I want to connect the markings I've made on each side, but they're going to be in a circular shape. So what I do is I find the middle of the dress and then measure down again. I check the measurement and do the exact same with the diagonals. The more markings I put on this dress, the more accurate the curve is going to be. Once you feel you have enough markings, you can then go and join them up in a circular shape. If you feel you need to stop and add a few more markings, just go ahead and do that. I had to do that for the bottom of the skirt as it's a bit wider there. After the front is completely marked out, I can then turn the dress over and then repeat the process for the back. You can use the previous markings as a guide and also so they match up. I decide to make my rows of tulle uniform distances from the waistline. However, her dress is isometric, so if you want to plan yours a bit differently from mine, you could always try it. So once you've finished the front and the back, it will look like this. And you can move on to the next step, which is adding the tulle. I bought this red tulle from Etsy. I ended up using between 12 and 14 metres for the skirt alone. When making the tulle rows, it is best to start at the bottom. It's a good idea to do a test beforehand and work out how much you want to gather the tulle. To find out the length of tulle I need to cut for row 8, I measured the length of the row and multiply it by the amount I want to gather it, which is to double it, which is 2. That ended up being 50 centimetres times 2, which is 100 centimetres for row 8. I actually add on about 10 centimetres to these measurements, and that's because the tulle needs to overlap, so that gives me scope to be able to cut the row at an angle and hide the seam. I measure and do this calculation for every single row, and that means I can work out how much tulle I need to order. Just remember to measure around the front and the back. I actually made this tulle cutting guide when I bought my fabric. It was really so I could work out how many metres I needed to order. I actually ended up ordering about 16 metres for the full entire project. Feel free to use this guide or do something similar when you're ordering yours. When cutting the tulle, we need to work out how much excess is to be cut off. I've decided that each row would be roughly 15 centimetres wide. This will give me enough scope later to kind of chop and change the shape of all the rows. I also did a test for opacity. I decided that that would be 8 layers for each row. So to get the full width for each row, I take the row width and multiply it by the amount of layers. Therefore it would be 15 centimetres times 8, which is 120 centimetres. The tulle that I ordered is actually 170 centimetres wide. So I go ahead and cut off 50 centimetres width from the full length of the tulle throughout the whole of the 12 to 14 metres that I used. The excess fabric that I'm cutting off can get used for other rows. Now we can cut our tulle into sections for each row. To be able to cut this tulle, I refer back to my tulle cutting guide. So the way I'm going to measure out and cut this is row 1, then row 2, row 4, row 5, row 7, and then row 8. Row 3 and row 6 will get cut off the excess that I've actually cut off already. I've planned it out that way. And there's also going to be excess material on the ends for the top and for the straps. So starting with row 1, I take my measurement. Row 1 is actually the material that goes around my waist. It gets sewn into the seam between the top and the skirt. This row ended up being roughly 1.5 meters. To mark where to cut, I use a sewing clip. Then I line up the tulle with the edge of my table and cut straight. It might also be an idea to put a paperweight in the middle of this to stop it sliding. If you're not confident about cutting straight, you could put another clip at the other side to give you a guide, or you could measure it out and mark with chalk. Folding the tulle for the rows probably looks like an easy task, but it is not. Tulle is quite temperamental and tends to kind of stick to itself, and so to help me keep everything in place, I use sewing clips. I can't stress enough how helpful these were when doing this. Firstly, I fold the width in half. I then secure the ends with sewing clips to stop them moving about. It's a good idea to lift up the tulle occasionally and give it a shake. This will make sure you can retain the fold at the halfway point. You may also notice I'm placing a steel rule on top of the tulle. I'm essentially using this as a paperweight to stop the tulle moving about. To be able to put sewing clips on the full length of the tulle, just move it along the table until you get to the end. Once the sewing clips are all in place, I can then happily fold it over again. To do this, hold the side with the clips and fold it over to match the other side. Then use the clips that are on one side to clip both the edges together. Continue adjusting the clips until you get to the end. As before, I recommend lifting the tulle, giving it a shake and making sure that everything is in place. Then take the tulle row, flip it over so that the clips are on the side closer to you. I personally found it easier when they were in this position for folding. Make sure your tulle is sitting flat with everything in place before you attempt to fold it over again. So I use the sewing clips again to stop the ends moving about. If need be, lift it up again and shake it. The width of this tulle should be roughly 15 centimeters. If it's a little bit more than this, then that's fine. I'll be cutting a lot of this tulle later when I shape the dress. One thing you need to be careful of with the folded tulle is that there's no gap between all the tulle at the folded part. If there's big gaps between the tulle, it means when you go to sew it, it might not catch all the tulle. So you need to sort of make sure this doesn't happen before you go to sew, otherwise you'll need to undo all your work and start again. The purpose of my first stitch is to gather the tulle row. I have a magnetic guide that I use with my sewing machine. This ensures that my sewing is straight. I decide to use a straight stitch for this, however there are other methods, like there's a zigzag stitch that you can try, and there's also a foot you can get for your sewing machine that does it for you. Whenever gathering fabric, you want to make sure that you pull both threads from the machine and keep them quite long. This is something you're going to hold on to later so that you can pull the threads and create the gathers. I now start sewing and use my left hand to guide the fabric through the machine. This is a temporary stitch, so do not backstitch. If you do find the ends are gathering slightly as they go through, this is totally fine. I do recommend sewing the folded part of the tulle and not the sort of raw edges where the clips are. I find doing this to be a lot neater, and sometimes the raw edges can be a bit uneven. When sewing tulle together, it is recommended you use the highest tension. You also want to use the longest stitch length to be able to make bigger ruffles and avoid snapping the thread or damaging the tulle. When you get to the end of the tulle, remember, do not backstitch, and what you want to do is pull the pressure foot lever up, move your tulle away from the machine, and then cut the threads so that they are long. If you haven't ever gathered fabric before, I would recommend doing 2 rows of sewing with a gap in between. Occasionally the thread can break, so this is like a backup in case that happens. To create the ruffle for the skirt, hold the threads in one hand. Use your other hand to move the tulle along the thread so it starts to gather. If you find it easier holding one of the threads and not 2, then do that. Continue ruffling the row of tulle until they look a bit more uniform. You don't want to have a lot of ruffles in one part and then have a big flat bit next to it. Now the aim is to get the tulle row to match the measurement on the dress. If your measuring tape isn't long enough, then fold your tulle over and use the half measurement as a guide. to get the full measurement. And then keep this in mind when I am measuring. If you work this out now, it will make the pinning process a lot easier. If the tulle row is too long, then I create more ruffles by pulling the fabric along the thread. If the length of the row is too short, then I relax the ruffles, pulling them towards the edges to make it longer. Once you have completed this step for your first row of tulle, I would then go back to the cutting stage, folding stage and gathering stage for each row. To pin the tulle rows to your skirt, I would start with row 8 at the bottom. It is much easier to sew the rows this way, otherwise you'll constantly have tulle you'll need to pin out the way as you do each row. When pinning tulle fabric, I recommend using ball-headed pins. As we know, tulle is a mesh, so the ball part stops the pin from getting caught inside the tulle. It also is more gentle on the tulle, so it will stop any runs in the fabric. When you're pinning, also note which direction you're going to be sewing in, as when you sit at the machine you want the ball part of the pin to be nearest you, so you can easily remove them. When I put the pins into the tulle and the fabric, I basically want to line them up with the chalk markings. When you're sewing, create a back stitch and then continue sewing along the length of your row. You want to sew in line with your pins and remove them as you go. Just make sure to not sew on top of a pin, as this can break your needle. When you get to the end, do a back stitch. I actually repeat this process and sew a second line of thread. This ensures that the tulle is securely attached to the fabric. Once row 8 is securely sewed on, we can then work backwards and sew all the other rows. We obviously don't sew row 1 yet, as that goes in the seam between the top and the skirt. Since 5 of the tulle rows go around the whole dress, I just want to add that for rows 1 to 2 I started and stopped the layers at the zip. For rows 3 to 5 I staggered these and hid them somewhere around the back so they weren't all in the same place. I did this to make the seams less obvious. It's really important when sewing the tulle rows that you keep checking with your hand underneath the dress to make sure that you're not catching anything on the opposite side of the dress in your sewing. Doing this can be really frustrating, as you would have to unpick all your work and then do it again. Now that rows 2 to 8 are attached to the skirt, it is now a good time to separate the ends of the tulle. From the way it was folded earlier, some of these ends are loose and some are kind of folded at the end. So I use a pair of fabric scissors and cut along the fold right at the end. When I'm doing this, I'm pulling the tulle away from the skirt. This ensures I'm cutting it on the fold. I repeat this process for every single row. After rows 2 to 8 are sewn and cut, this is what it looked like. When I drape row 1 over this, you can see roughly how it would look. Keep in mind that on my base dress, I ended up changing the waistline. I also want to add that I did end up adding a layer 9. I just felt the dress needed an extra bit of length. I add that later in tutorial 5. Next up, we'll be adding sequins and rhinestones to the top and draping the top. Since rows 1 to 5 actually went around the whole dress. Since rows 1 to 5 actually go around the whole dress, I just want to add that I actually staggered where they started and stopped. I hid the joins at the back, but they were never in the same place. I hid the joins in the back, but they were never in the same place.